How you doing? Welcome back to History and Coffee. And today I'm going to be covering a subject that is incredibly misunderstood, and that's post-traumatic stress disorder. And now, before you're like, "Whoa, that's a psychological topic. This is a history, project." As long as there has been accounts of battles, recorded accounts, there has also been recorded accounts of soldiers facing difficulties, mental difficulties from the results of these battles. And there's just this weird sort of misconception floating around out there today that like PTSD is this sort of generational new thing because our society has gotten weak and men can't handle combat because, and it's utter bullshit. So, what I'm going to do is we're going to walk back through history and we're going to talk about some of the first recorded accounts of post traumatic stress disorder and some of the famous people throughout history that have been affected by it. And we're going to start all the way in ancient Greece. This is as far back as I could find. The sophist Gorgias, I believe, was an ancient Greek philosopher. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that whole spiel. But he wrote about soldiers returning home from battle being victim to useless labor and hardly curable madness. These guys would come back and be listless and anxious, and they would suffer mental illness. And they, even back in the Greek, ancient Greece, they recognized that this was a result of armed combat. And then, of course, when you get to Alexander the Great, a brilliant tactician. He's remembered for, essentially conquering the known world at the time. But what people don't really know about him is that he was also a frontline soldier. He was fond of leading an elite cavalry unit that would make up the left flank of his famous hoplite phalanx formations. And most of these battles that took place, he took part in and received a lot of grievous wounds. He was even cleaved in the head by a sword. And of course, towards the end of his life, if you look at the accounts, you'll notice that people start to describe him as drinking too much, being erratic, being, listless, anxious, classic post-traumatic stress symptoms. And this went on up until, finally his death. And some people blame this his behavior on a possible syphilis, and that of course could be the case. But you don't walk away from getting cleaved in the head by a sword, a-okay. And then you skip ahead to Roman times. The great general Marius, I believe. His biographer, of course, he was a very accomplished Roman general, led many successful campaigns. And again, back then you led from the front. You didn't, if you stood back and let your men go out and do the fighting, that you would lose the respect of your men and they would generally kill you. So if you were a general back then, you were the first person, sort of throwing a spear or swinging a sword. This was not like it is today, where you have guys in air-conditioned offices that are, typing on computer screens. But his biographer at the time wrote that he was worn out with toils and deluged with anxieties, and that he would be tortured with reflections. And that sounds to me a lot like flashbacks and a result of traumatic stress from combat. And of course, Marius was, the baddest. You talk about Alexander the Great and Marius, these were the baddest guys around. So it's something to consider. Of course, the next the Dark Ages in between the fall of the Roman Empire, and there's not a lot of really good um, documentation in there. It was kind of an interesting time. But if we fast forward then to the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, this battle was interesting because it was one of history's bloodiest. It was a decisive victory for the English against the French, but many aristocrats took part in this battle, so it's very well documented, and there is great detail out there about the afflictions that these men faced after this horrifyingly bloody battle. Um, Again, if you understand the definition of what post traumatic stress disorder is, you could superimpose that over any of these accounts from history. And then it's interesting, we get into the modern age, um, and in World War One, and people are, you know, they understand post traumatic. If we jump back to the Civil War, actually in America's history before World War One, people referred to post traumatic stress disorder as soldier's heart, and this was something that was seen as part of the. It was the consequence of combat. It was understood and accepted. And of course, there was all these ridiculous things put forward, like it was caused by a soldier wearing his pack straps too tight. That was one account that I found when I was researching this. It's interesting, but again, it was accepted as a consequence of combat. And the general understanding was you don't go into combat and walk away the same. And it's interesting how in more modern times we've sort of reversed that now, that it's seen as like a weakness or something like that if you come back affected because you've been put in a situation where you've had to kill in defense of your life and defense of others and things like that. It's a big regression. But we get into World War One and we see now this is the age of shell shock. Men experience in the trenches constant raids from enemy soldiers, almost a 24-hour artillery bombardment. There are shells falling day and night in the millions. And men, as a result of this, would suffer what they referred to as shell shock, and it would be so extreme in cases, these men would literally go limp. They couldn't move. They couldn't talk. They couldn't do anything. They would just shake. And there's a couple of interesting documentaries specifically about shell shock in World War One on YouTube that I would suggest you look into, because it's going to go into a lot more detail than I will here. But again, the armies of the time understood this as a symptom of combat, and these men were treated very well. They were brought out of the lines. They were sent to sort of convalesce in estates and things like that were volunteered by people of nobility, and they would have these people living on the grounds, and they would stay there until they felt better. Or, if they didn't, they would just stay there. It's interesting to note that the last surviving British World War One veteran actually passed away in one of these homes, convalescing from his experience during the Great War. He was over 100 years old, and despite all that time, he never truly got over what happened and was never able to really live on his own. And then we get into World War II and we take this turn. And I don't understand quite what happened. The biggest reason, I guess, would be sort of a necessity of war, that regardless of psychological damage, people needed to be on the front lines fighting because it was a global emergency. And shell shock was turned into what was called by the British LMF, which stood for lacking moral fiber. And this was, again, the same thing. This was extremely prevalent in World War II British Lancaster bomber crews because of the schedules and attrition rate. These guys would fly multiple sorties a day, and generally you were expected to survive maybe 2 or 3 sorties, and you would have to do 7 in one day or something like that. And these guys would, again, like in World War One, they would just freeze up and not be able to move. And rather than being sent to convalesce, a lot of times they were jailed, and some were even hung. They would be stamped with this lacking moral fiber in their file. and essentially branded a coward. And this, of course, happened in the United States as well. Even, men like Audie Murphy, who distinguished themselves in combat, I mean, they came home to problems. Audie Murphy drank. He drank like a fish, and he damn near spent the entirety of the money that he'd made making those movies after he got out. And it's really sad that this all took place. And then, of course, this stigma then from this lacking moral fiber follows America up into Vietnam. Men are experiencing a new form of warfare, a guerrilla war. They're forced to fight a war of attrition where the goal is to inflict so much damage on the enemy that their ability to fight is removed. They experience booby traps, torture, everything under the sun. And when they come home afflicted, they're branded as cowards. And still, to this day, in popular media, a lot of people like to mock these guys. And it's like, I would like to see somebody have one of these people that's making these jokes and things like that go say something like that to Alexander the Great or General Marius, because I think you would have ended up catching a sword yourself. And now, reason we're in modern times now, PTSD, as it's now called, post-traumatic stress disorder, which we know psychologically to be the outcome of prolonged exposure to trauma, be that combat or other. And it's seen as a consequence of war. We know that this is something that's going to happen, and it's going to happen a lot. And instead of becoming accepting of this historical law, essentially, going back as far as as far as there has been documentation of battles, there's been documentation of soldiers having problems. We've gone now, and instead of accepting it, we've stigmatized it. So now when a soldier is suffering from PTSD, it's not as a result of his sacrifice and his bravery. It's because he's weak or insane or he's going to be violent and all of these things that just aren't true. The fact of the matter is, if you fight in a battle, you will walk away with PTSD. The chances of that not happening are like probably 1 to 2%. And PTSD is not what we think it is. The media likes to jump out, of course, and say, oh, this guy went and shot up his work and it was because he was suffering from PTSD. PTSD is, in its simplest terms, an anxiety disorder. And of course, if we dig more into these historical events that I'm citing, like, mass shootings and things like that the media likes to blame PTSD for, we find other things like drug abuse, schizophrenia, paranoid delusions, things that are not related to PTSD. So that's something that I want you to think about and consider, especially when you hear things about PTSD in the media, you hear people talking about it and people making jokes about it. Understand that this is a consequence of war. And if we're going to continue to engage in war, we're going to continue to have to deal with soldiers with PTSD. And we're going to have to do it with kindness and understanding. Because if you're willing to vote for people that are going to send these men to kill, then you're responsible for their care. There's no way around that. So that's the history of post-traumatic stress disorder. And I want to thank Sarah, my biggest fan, for getting me this cool new mug. And I also wanted to take a moment to give a plug for a good friend of mine who actually helped me with the research for this video. He's a former history professor, and I've collaborated with him before on some projects, but he runs a surplus store called Fire Force Ventures out of Canada. And they have anything, if you were into military history, they got it. They have everything from Rhodesian brushstroke to like East German, surplus from the Cold War. If you want a real tangible piece of history, go check out fireforceventures.com. They're constantly running sales. They just got through moving to a bigger facility, so definitely check them out. Check them out on Facebook. I'll post a link to their shop on my Facebook page, which you should go and like if you haven't yet. History and Coffee. So, again, thank you for listening to me ramble. Hope you learned something, and cheers.